Welcome back to UC Davis Live. I'm Satirius Johnson. For almost a year, millions of school and college students have been going to class remotely. Now, with vaccines becoming available, governments and school districts are planning how to return students to the classroom. What impact has the last year had on learning from kindergarten to college? What are the educational challenges for teachers and students in going back to the classroom? Well, joining us today to discuss these questions are two experts from the UC Davis School of Education. Michal Kurlaender is a professor and department chair of the School of Education and a member of the National Academy of Education. She studies students' pathways, access to, and success in higher education. With colleagues from the California Education Lab at UC Davis, she surveyed college-age students about their experiences in the pandemic for the California Student Aid Commission. And Kevin G. is an associate professor in the School of Education affiliated with the Center for Poverty Research. He studies how schooling affects children's health and well-being and how school policies can improve health and educational outcomes for children who face a wide range of challenges such as bullying, food insecurity, abuse, and neglect. Thanks to you both for coming on today.
Thank you for having us.
So before we get started, I just wanted to remind viewers that this is a free webcast. You can watch it live and watch it after the live broadcast on the UC Davis Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels. We're aware of others posting links saying that you have to pay to watch this video. That is not true. Please do not click on those links. This is a free webcast. And we are taking audience questions. So if you're watching us live, just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. So Michal, I'd like to start with you. You surveyed about 76,000 college and college-bound students about their experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tell us a bit about the survey and what were the key findings?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, last spring, we were in conversation with the California Student Aid Commission, which is the state agency that administers all financial aid for students in California. And we're very much concerned, as were others, about the state of students right now with the pandemic. And at the time, of course, we didn't believe this would be the situation we were still in, naively perhaps. And so we decided to, in last May, to survey students, both high school students who had applied for financial aid and planned to be enrolled this year, as well as all current students attending California community colleges, Cal State University campuses, UCs, and other private institutions. And we asked them a number of questions around the kind of struggles that they were experiencing. We learned that the majority of them had lost some or all of their income in terms of jobs. And keep in mind, many of these students work study jobs and other kinds of jobs on campuses. And also we asked them about the uncertainty that they had about the fall. We asked students about the stressors in their life, what they were concerned with in terms of going to college, everything from remote instruction, also paying for technology needs, stresses at home with health and family. We learned that most students were still planning to pursue and continue on with their educational plans, but many were unsure and uncertain about how many classes they would be able to take, their ability to be able to be successful in the remote environment. Mm-hmm. And just a quick teaser, we were back out in the field this fall. We surveyed another 100,000 students again, and the results from that, we're still analyzing that data and we'll be able to update. Many of those students are also students who also did the survey in last spring, but we're able to continue to track with the California Student Aid Commission the needs of our students across the state and to provide policymakers with information about what they can do to support students. We know nationally that we're seeing declines in college enrollment, and then that is being felt very unevenly, primarily at community colleges and primarily for students finishing high school and students who are from low-income backgrounds. And so this lower declines in enrollment that we're seeing across the country and in the state are not being evenly felt. They're disproportionately impacting particular communities and for students who are attending community colleges in particular.
So a lot of far-ranging effects happening, and it's great that you're able to kind of figure out what is exactly happening. Did anything surprise you in your findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think importantly, we learned that students are committed to staying in school and are very much planning to pursue their educational goals. They weren't abandoning them. Again, as the data continues to come out, and we're seeing reports of this and across, a lot of media, that we're seeing declining enrollments, we're worried about that. So they clearly have an intention to pursue their educational goals, but are perhaps experiencing a lot of struggles to get there. Other things that surprised me, we also left students open-ended questions to just tell us in their own words the way that they were being impacted by the pandemic. And many described the challenges of supporting their families, the difficulty to concentrate on their studies with what was going on in their home environment, taking care of siblings, supporting their families, having to work because a parent is sick or has lost their job. And so what surprised us was, again, the sort of the magnitude that the pandemic has had on the sort of basic needs of students, the economic conditions they're in, and the health environment that they're in. And so all that, I'm sure we'll talk about later as the show goes, has really important consequences on how students are able to, engage in school and the types of distractions that they're experiencing.
Right, right. Kevin, I'd like to ask you, what do we know about K through 12 students? How are they doing after a year of remote learning?
Yeah, so Soterios, when I think about this question about how they're doing, I immediately go to, I think, a concern that all of us have in education, from policymakers to classroom teachers to parents, and that's this concept of learning loss, right? So when we talk about learning loss, it's really this lower amount of learning that's happening during this pandemic relative to the amount of learning that would typically happen kind of pre-pandemic. We don't quite know what learning loss looks like this academic year, but if anything, if this year is like anything like last year, we could expect some learning losses. So I just wanted to highlight some findings from a report that just came out from an organization that both Dr. Kurlaender and I do work with, called Policy Analysis for California Education, or PACE. They looked at data from 18 districts covering about 50,000 students in 4th through 10th grade. They looked at data from the 2019 to 2020 year, from fall to fall. What they found were learning losses, and there were learning losses both in English language arts as well as math. I think a couple of things that I wanted to underscore for you and our audience today is, when we look at those losses tend to be concentrated or greater in some of the earlier grades. So we're talking about losses in 4th and 5th grade that are much larger in magnitude relative to the higher grades. Second thing is, these losses were more pronounced for some of California's most marginalized, disadvantaged groups. When we look at losses, for example, for English language learners, if we just look at 5th grade English language learners, their losses are nearly 30% of the typical gains that they would have made. Now, all students have lost, but they've experienced kind of lesser losses in that. So that's kind of the academic learning loss piece. Again, my work focuses on socio-emotional health and well-being. My sense is there's also going to be patterns with sort of declines in socio-emotional well-being. We also know anecdotally mental health issues, physical health issues are also a huge concern. One more quick thing, as probably Dr. Kurlaender can tell you, I'm also a bit of an optimist, so I like to find kind of silver linings in some of this. There was some large scale data that came out from the Northwest Educational Association that kind of looked at 1 in 10 public schools across the US. What they did is they compared reading achievement levels of 3rd through 8th graders last fall in 2019 to this fall in 2020. And those reading scores were actually comparable. So students were still making gains during the fall 2019 to fall 2020 year. So that is a bit of a silver lining. But again, I think overall, we are still concerned about the kind of learning losses that might be happening as we're speaking today.
Right. And you mentioned emotional health. So do you have any metrics or any kind of data on how students K through 12 have been dealing with this remote learning and not being able to be close to their friends, and what kinds of impacts those things are having
Yeah.
on kids?
Great question. I think early on in the pandemic, saw early surveys that were being given to students in our K through 12 system. And I think similar to what Dr. Kurlaender mentioned in terms of the student responses in terms of higher ed, you're seeing the same kind of responses that kids K through 12 are feeling. They're feeling a bit disconnected. They want to be with their friends. Levels of anxiety, depression, I think are definitely on their minds. And so again, we know that schools serve more than just an academic purpose. So we need to be thinking about the kind of supports that schools need to be providing to look after the socio-emotional well-being of our students.
How well do you think schools and teachers and students have adapted?
Yeah, so when I think about how how students and teachers have adapted. There's actually a survey that was just conducted in January, and some of those results just came out last week. There was a survey conducted of about 120 teachers. They're part of this network called the California Teacher Consultant Response Network. They gave their opinions about how they think they're doing, as well as their students. So I'll just share with you some of the findings that came out. A bit over half of those teachers, about 54% of those teachers, they felt that distance learning was somewhat effective in meeting their students' needs. They also, about half of them also believe that students are learning and they're benefiting from school. Now, having said that, on the flip side, a majority of teachers did express concern over some of the academic harms that are being done in the wake of distance learning, and particular concern for some of our most disadvantaged students. Again, English language learners, socioeconomically disadvantaged youth, foster youth. And again, I think teachers are definitely well aware and concerned over student mental health issues.
Just want to remind anyone watching live that we are taking audience questions. So if you are watching us live, just leave them in the comments section and we'll work into as many as we can. So I guess for either you, Michal, or Kevin, what are some things that we've learned in the past year about remote learning, both at schools and in higher education?
I'm happy to start. I'll say, I think first of all, we learned that there's some basic conditions under which it works well. And the first is some stability in your kind of learning environment, right? So do you have a place to, do you have the most basic access? We've learned that access to technology and accessibility for remote instruction is key. It's become a basic need for students, but also from whether you're a kindergartner or a parent who's trying to complete their post-secondary credential or degree, you need sort of how much distraction you have in your home, whether it's health or again food insecurity or a place to study or work. All of these things matter a lot. And so if you're a teacher, you've seen that, whether you're like me and Kevin teaching college students, even graduate students, or you're teaching elementary school students, like you see the differences in sort of students' ability to even engage, right? And I think, like Kevin, I'm also optimistic that schools, as we know, won't be back to normal ever, hopefully, because we've learned from this long experience. And for some students, the remote environment is probably successful for a variety of reasons, right? But what we do know is that some basic conditions need to be met, and that when we see students, whether their cameras are on or off, what's going behind the scenes in terms of their ability to engage varies dramatically. And so I don't think we'll go back to sort of, so many, look at even the University of California, we've been able to pivot so successfully. I think we do need to applaud our K-12 schools and our post-secondary systems for doing this. I mean, we had talked about it and we knew there were online environments already happening, but the ability of these institutions to pivot to remote instruction is pretty remarkable. And I don't think we learned a lot from that. And I think what it looks like in the future for the students for whom it could, continue to benefit, we should continue to explore. But we shouldn't assume that just because, we gave, a link that everybody's been able to engage. And I think that that's what we're learning, whether you're a kindergartner or a graduate student even.
And by engage, you mean not only necessarily, have access to Wi-Fi, but you're also talking about just being able to stay focused, not be distracted by things happening in the home. I mean, what other factors are there?
That's right, exactly. And I mean, think about even our undergraduate students, if they're watching, would relate to this, the ability to find a student that you sat next to as the instructor gave an assignment and you weren't quite sure about it and you talked, and then that conversation led to, hey, can we touch base this weekend about it? There's any number of ways in which you connected both with me as an instructor coming up to me after the end of a lecture or with a peer, right, to connect. Similarly, students in K-12 environments who have the technology to be on various platforms that I'm not going to remember the name of, that my 12-year-old son uses, have ways to connect and have supports when they don't understand something, right? So my ability to provide my children a tutor or additional engagement if I don't feel like they're able to get it through public schools. So engagement in the fullest extent of the educational experience, and that does include social emotional supports, right? we have sent students to public schools for much more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic for decades. We wanted them to learn how to be good citizens, interact with their peers, understand the world. And so we should continue to explore the ways in which different schooling environments have fostered that kind of peer interaction and ability to support one another.
And then that might even be more important at the K through 12 level, Kevin. I'm guessing, like, students at that age, from kindergarten, not even before, they're learning socialization more so than at any other time in their lives. So what have we learned, in K through 12 schools about, remote learning this past year?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Just want to underscore the point that Michal made around this engagement piece, but also the connection, right? We know that connecting with adults matters. We know that connecting with peers matters. That's how kids get socialized, right? That's extremely difficult over a remote platform. I mean, even anecdotally in my own experiences working with students, it's difficult. I like to read the room when I teach. I like to be able to look at reactions and faces. And now we're in this world where it's tough to do that. It's tough to read people's emotions and behaviors. So I think the more kind of, again, supports that schools can be providing to kids, be it one-on-one meetings, be it calls to check in with students. I even know anecdotally of schools who did kind of one-on-one home visits, socially distanced with masks, just to check in on how kids are doing, especially the kids that we don't know much about. So just quickly, I mentioned the data that we saw about learning losses. That learning loss is capturing the students we do see. There are tons of students that don't show up in the data because they are not being connected well with in terms of the system. I think of foster youth, I think of homeless youth. So I think all these ideas about connecting and supports are only as good as if the students are present and we know where they're at.
I know I've seen media reports of elementary school teachers paying visits to their students' homes, staying socially distanced, maybe outside at the front door, but just kind of to have that human connection still there to some degree.
Yeah, I think it's such a vital piece, and it'll be a vital piece when we eventually come back to schooling. How do we continue to kind of sustain the interactions and kind of rebuild the kind of lost connections that were not made because of this remote learning situation we're all in?
Now, oh, please, Michal,
I
yes.
just want to add that I think the other thing we've learned in this environment is just how critical schools are to the fabric of our society, right? And the place they serve, particularly for families who may have some greater needs. I mean, we continue to see school districts, schools in particular, and across the country, who are providing free meals to families at this time period. That has continued from work we've done through PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education. We see that one of the things that schools did very, very well even last spring was continue to ensure that students who were able to get free free lunches and sometimes even dinners or breakfast continue to come to school sites to get those for themselves and often for their whole families.
Right. So, governments, of course, school districts, they're now wrestling with how to return to classroom teaching. So leaving aside the safety issues, things like masks and vaccination, are there things schools and colleges need to be doing right now to transition back from remote learning?
Well, I will just emphasize the biggest and most important thing that I think they need to do is focus on kind of wrestle with the fact that this pandemic has exacerbated inequalities that we have. And so I think we have to say that over and over again. The learning losses that Dr. G referred to, the disengagement, the access technology, all of it has been consistently worse for particular communities, for communities of color, for low-income families and communities. And we must prioritize that, whether it's through mental health, through sort of thinking about learning time, strengthening conditions and supports. We are going to face many decades of exacerbating inequalities if we don't address this now. So we had inequalities before in our education systems and in our society that were, that many of us were aware of, but what all of the data that is emerging, that's coming out, whether it's health, access to vaccinations, everything that we're seeing in terms of how this pandemic has implicated different communities, we're going to address those in education. And so I think it's important to know that we need to prioritize prioritize that from the beginning. The other one I would just say, at least for the K-12 space, is that we really is also is shown the relationship that schools have with their communities. We see some of that has been in strife in terms of disagreement about opening. But what we do know is that we're going to need to engage our communities and our families, again, who have differences of opinion and set of relationships with their schools and with teachers. And we need to figure out how to engage communities to open schools in a way that all of our students and their families feel safe and supported. And I think colleges, again, are going to face some of those same things. We're going to have students, high school students, who have put off their plans to go off to college. That's where we're seeing those declining enrollments. We have to get those students back. We can't let that generation go. Their implications for their lifetime earnings, for their likelihood of unemployment, are really dependent on a college degree. We know that's the single most important safety net for students, for young people to be able to get jobs, to protect them from recession, and that's just for economic outcomes. We also know there's sort of health outcomes associated with sort of increasing education. And so we must ensure that those students who have paused, their lives have kind of been suspended. If we don't get them back in school and towards a college degree, they and their communities and our whole society will suffer as a result.
And just to add to what Michal was saying, just to kind of expand, I think on the K through 12 side, I think about what schools need to do to figure out first where students are at, and then thinking about strategies to help them recover some of that learning loss. And how do we continue to create conditions that help support our students to succeed? So there's been different models that we know exist out there. There have been models of accelerated learning. There's been models of providing individualized tutoring and supports to kids that can help them at least recover some of those academic learning losses. We still don't know a lot about how one goes about recovering any kind of socio-emotional losses that have been incurred over the past year and a half. I think a second thing that I also think about is, going back to school in person is not just flipping a switch. And we also know that this virus is unpredictable. And so when I think about when schools get back to in-person schooling, I think there also needs to be a plan for what happens if there is an outbreak, for example. How might we think about pivoting back to some type of remote learning? And if we think about not just about schools in terms of teachers and students, but these are schooling systems. And we got to think about the bus drivers, the important folks who prepare school meals, the front office staff, all of those individuals who serve such an important support role to the infrastructure of schools has been impacted by this pandemic, and that impact is not going away. So if all of those underlying components are also impacted, if one of those parts faces these pandemic related challenges, it's going to send ripple effects throughout the system. So how do we ensure that there's kind of backup plans and plans in case there is some type of unexpected issue that arises because of this pandemic?
Right. I mean, do either of you think there is a solution that could be applied nationwide to school systems nationwide or to universities nationwide? Or is it something that, each university and each school system is going to have to reinvent the wheel for their own, local area?
We're looking at each other.
Michal, I'll let you start.
I mean, I think, there's a strong tradition of state and local control in education. And so we're definitely, I think the best way to answer your question is we should learn from what's happening elsewhere. We shouldn't reinvent the wheel, but we also do have, again, a strong tradition of local control and of state, and state differences. And so I think we will see, hopefully, innovation, some things that work, some things that don't work. There's a number of other factors that impact sort of education decision-making, local governance issues, teacher unions, things like that. And those obviously play a really important role. I think, again, I think stepping back, we see how much our economy, our whole society is built around this public school, the need for public schools to function well for students and their families. And so as we've asked them to sort of do so much for students and their families, I do believe that, sort of figuring out the resource structures that allow them to be flexible to address the kinds of things that Kevin is referring to, if they're going to also be, ensuring kind of greater supports for mental health. I'll throw another one that we haven't discussed, but that I know Dr. G can speak a lot about, is students with disabilities.
Yeah.
All of those students with individualized education plans to address their special needs, a lot of those have not been able to be met at this time. And so again, we're asking a lot of schools and of teachers, and I think we do need to think about the resources. And these are frontline workers in every way, and so you're seeing them getting prioritized now with vaccinations across the country, but it does, stepping back, require us to sort of now realize what an important role they play and to invest in them and the people who work in them more directly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we can think about sort of broad guiding principles, but again, there's not going to be a sort of one size fits all approach. I think each district, each school, each teacher, they're going to need to really think about the students that they serve and really think about what are the specific interests and needs, and make adaptations. Again, our essential teachers are the ones that know our students the best. And I think, to sort of echo a point that Michal made, I think it's also about partnerships as well. How do parents partner with teachers? How do they partner with some of our school leaders to really, put students at the kind of the forefront of this, and to ensure that their needs are being met, both academically as well as, as we've talked about, socio-emotionally.
I know we're very early into this, going back to school, getting back into the classroom, but have you seen any examples of, anything emerging as that something could be a model that other school systems or other universities could use?
I mean, I don't know if we have evidence on how it's going. What we do learn is that kids and parents want their kids to be in school, and teachers too, right? So what we're seeing is kind of celebration across social media that my kids are back in school. Yes, it's only 2 days a week, or it's hybrid, or parents equally excited, teachers equally excited to welcome their students back safely, of course. But so I think what we're seeing is sort of people, again, as you suggest, innovation in how that's being done. But what it does, sort of a really important thing that just we didn't have data until about now almost 2-3 weeks ago, that the state has put out, showing us across it's through the governor's office, and we can make that website available, but that shows us every school district in California, the extent to which they're online, remote, exclusively remote, hybrid, or in person. And so as we collect that data, PACE is also collecting important data on the state, on school districts' plans for returning back to school. And so I think we'll be able to analyze that for many years to come, to understand the implications of not just this whole, remote instruction, but the differences that school districts took to do hybrid learning, the instructional approaches, assessments, diagnostics for students. There's a number of things that we will be able to research and monitor down the road.
Do you think, are there students who are going to be needing any special consideration in the future because of this past year? I know you mentioned disabled students are, disproportionately affected. Moving forward, as we hopefully come out of this pandemic, and there will be the repercussions for a lot of students, who's going to need special consideration? What kind of consideration?
Yeah, Kevin, start.
Yeah, you mentioned students with disabilities. I also think about the kinds of students that we here in California, as well as the nation, care about and have made commitments to: English language learners, socioeconomically disadvantaged youth, as well as foster youth. These are the kids who were already behind pre-pandemic. They were grade levels behind. And once the pandemic hit, we can only imagine how further they've fallen behind. So I think groups that our state, California, has prioritized need to continue to be a priority. Having said that, I think all of our students are going to need some levels of supports. One other quick thing, and Michal had mentioned this a bit earlier, I do think there are also students who are thriving in this kind of online schooling environment as well. And anecdotally, there's been models of schools that have been able to transition their kids well into this kind of online learning. So we shouldn't necessarily kind of throw out things that we've learned this year as well about what parts of the kind of remote learning experience have actually worked for some of our students. Students, for example, who may have been victims of bullying, who were afraid to go to school, or students that didn't feel like schooling was a supportive environment, but now they could do it remotely and have the kind of supports that they needed to engage with schooling in kind of a remote way.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Parents who were in college, right? Many of them, the fact that there's more remote options, and I do believe our post-secondary systems will continue to provide those remote options. That flexibility has been really important. We have in all of our open-ended responses, we have a report coming out on student parents, and we know that for some, that this has actually given them more flexibility. Many of them, of course, are also homeschooling their kids while they're doing remote instruction, but the increased flexibility, I think, is another one. I will say, just to answer your question about need, I spend a lot of my time thinking about the pathway to college, and I worry a lot about students who have used their high schools were their primary point of information and support in that, everything from filling out financial aid forms, application forms, figuring out what can I afford, where could I study, what kind of major, especially who we think of as first generation college students whose parents maybe didn't attend college or didn't finish college. And those schools, again, were providing much more additional supports beyond just sort of coursework and instruction, really support on how to advance their post-secondary goals. And we already saw information barriers that students had, but again, without schools serving in that role, those gaps get even wider. And because we see the declining enrollments in these high school seniors who just, again, have suspended their plans, I worry a lot that we need to sort of build a really intensive campaign to get these 18 to 20-year-olds to come back to college and to pursue those plans they had. We know students lose academic momentum, right? So students who stay in school continuously, who enroll for more than just part-time, are able to sort of see academic success, not just more quickly, but also just that momentum carries them into sort of longer persistence outcomes and ultimately to degree attainment. And so I think, again, we'll have all those high school counselors and how important they are. And just as Kevin said, other adults, creating a college going culture in high schools was something we've been doing for the last 2 decades. And all folks played a role in that and celebrated students' accomplishments and applying and getting into college. And this is a really important thing that the high school students that are just graduating now, but the years from last year and the class of 2021 will have to continue to really support them to come back to college.
Yeah, I agree. This college career readiness piece is important, and I do some work in that space with students in 10th, 11th grade. I think it's extremely important that we continue to sort of emphasize what college going pathways need to look like and also what careers look like, but also prepare them for the realities that we're in. We're in a very different economic environment now. What do careers look like and what do career pathways look like? So I think those of us who do work in that college career readiness space also need to kind of think about the realities that these students are graduating into socially, economically.
All right. I guess finally, to wrap up, how best can parents support their students as they go back to the classroom?
I think on the K through 12 side, we know from a really robust body of literature that parental support, parental engagement matters. How parents continue to support their kids, not just academically, but the kind of emotional supports that parents can provide. Parents can provide structure, stability, also reassurance. But I think an important piece is almost even backing up into that question and to say, but what are the supports that parents themselves need to do that, to take on that supportive role? And I think that's extremely important. When I think about that question, I immediately go to parents, say like single parents of color, who are women, that don't necessarily have the supports in place. And that really gets at to some of these broader, I think, structural barriers and challenges at play that have been impacting parents, single parents, right? Things that have constrained families during this pandemic, like poverty. Again, we've talked about forms of insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity. So I think we need to think about ways to kind of alleviate those broader structural challenges, right? And that's kind of, it broadens the scope of, just beyond what schools can do. And I think schools in partnership with our other systems, our public health system, our sort of economic support systems, I think we need to be thinking about ways to alleviate some of the stresses, the economic stresses that have been placed on families, so that parents eventually do get the space and the time and the bandwidth to be able to provide that type of support and engagement that we know is important to students and kids.
Michal?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo everything that Kevin has said. And just again, flipping it a little bit to the school side, it just schools and parents and families need to sort of come together. I think this is, the recovery is going to be about sort of a new type of collaboration between schools and communities and parents. And what we've learned is that parents don't necessarily all want the same thing. And so how can we ensure that parents are kind of play an important role in supporting kind of school districts to make the kind of flexible decisions that different types of families and different types of kids needs. And that may look again like, we may sort of face a different kind of set of instructional models for students that kind of cater to those different needs. And again, that there's a sort of a rebuilding of sort of trust around the sort of the health, but also the opportunities that different families have to access, right? So again, we can kind of continue to see the kind of, there's parents who are struggling for basic needs, as Kevin describes, and then there are parents who've basically taken things into their own hands. And, we see huge departures of families from public schools, some because they just aren't showing up disengaged, and some because they've actively sought out private schools or other opportunities because they felt unsatisfied by public schools' responses to remote instruction. And so again, further exacerbating the divide, parents who've been able to sort of get additional tutors, pods, any numbers of kind of an enhancement for their students, and how that will look moving forward, as again, some students have actually made gains, really important gains as a result of individualized instruction, access to more resources and tutoring, and others have struggled to even have bandwidth to be able to look at, to stream a class, right? Those types on a small, device, right? And so those kinds of instructional differences, just experiences, conditions across our families is going to impact the educational trajectories of these students. And which is why we're both so focused on addressing the inequalities that this has created.
Yeah, I feel like we just came full circle. Like it's, it's not just the educational system, it's kind of like the entire society. I mean, finances, families, economics. I mean, it just touches everything, and everything affects it. So there are a lot of issues that need to be, worked on to help kids in school and in college. Well, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your work.
Of course, enjoy this.
Thank you.
Michal Kurlaender is professor and department chair of the UC Davis School of Education and a member of the National Academy of Education. Kevin G is an associate professor in the UC Davis School of Education, affiliated with the Center for Poverty Research. Until next time, I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is UC Davis Live, COVID-19.